you don't have to go through this really difficult, like, I have to think about what are the, how do I make sure I'm engaging in these like 6 subcomponents of empathy, ecological empathy in this infrastructure design project that I'm doing. If you were using, say, an Indigenous worldview of almost any sort, you would be doing that pretty inherently. And so in some ways, this is just like a bit of a roadmap to say, okay, here's this thing that you need in Western worldviews that you don't have. You've systemically created a knowledge form that completely eliminates ecological knowledge. That's really problematic because we live on a planet. And so like using empathy as this guide, essentially, you can navigate your way back to having a relationship with the place where you are and where you actually are interdependent. And I think that can be a really energizing and connecting process. And it sure, there might be some pain and there might be some grief, but it doesn't have to be isolating.
Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today on the newscast, we speak with Lauren Lambert, a former PhD candidate at the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation at Arizona State University. In this conversation, Lambert speaks with Rachel Donald about the concept of ecological empathy, which she defines as a cognitive and affective ability that can be applied to policy and be used to design environments to address human-nature reconnection. These are practices that could be used to improve human infrastructure that take the needs of the more than human world into consideration and providing better outcomes for all. These concepts have appeared in discussions we've had on the podcast before, such as how better road design might save the lives of millions of animals, outlined by journalist Ben Goldfarb, or how ecological restoration begins with considering more than human species as design collaborators, described by Professor Laura Martin. Additionally, Rachel and I also discuss what it means to be empathetic in the first place, how the term can be misunderstood or misapplied, and the work one must do to be truly empathetic.
Lauren, welcome to Mongabay's podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks. It is a pleasure to be with you.
Now, I'm really excited to discuss your research with you. I think what it is that you're studying is hugely important, increasingly so in this world today. So let's dive straight in. What is ecological empathy?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So ecological empathy, as I define it and look at it, it's essentially a framework of practice for how to use empathy as a guide to connect to the more than human world and integrate our interdependence and relationships with the more than human world in everyday thinking, everyday practice, and specifically in the places where we work.
Yeah, I'm really interested in getting into this with you because I feel like empathy is one of those really fascinating things where how do you speak about it if you don't feel it? Or how do you speak about it to somebody that doesn't feel it? And so can we start there? Like, how do we even define empathy? And is there a way that we can provoke it, essentially, in people that may not quite know where to begin with grasping it?
Yeah, I think this is like one of the most interesting and also confusing aspects of the history of the term empathy, because it really emerged in like psychotherapeutic practice and also like cognitive therapy practice, where there are, essentially therapists were looking at how to both cultivate empathy in their client practitioner relationships and then also how to cultivate empathy in the people that they're working with. So it's one of these terms that's been, you could imagine that it's been like taken and dribbled around the court of like so many different academic fields and spaces. And so as a result, it's like there's so much kind of out there, But to be honest, like little deep work that's done to really create like a coherent conceptual understanding of it. And that's one of the things that I started noticing early on is that like, a lot of the measurements that people are still using for empathy are from the 80s. And they come within this very specific way of thinking about the world that is rooted in like positivist psychological understandings of psychological constructs. So empathy, that in some ways is like about connection. Most of our understandings of it like actually emerge through this very different practice, which is more in like a reductionist paradigm to kind of isolate and understand it from that perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if empathy is about connection, which is certainly my understanding of empathy, then how is it that I think what people sometimes struggle with empathy is that rather than kind of understanding that it's about connection, as you just explained, it's boiled down to you feel what somebody else feels. And in a world in which we're so deeply separated from one another and we have what feels like very individual experiences, and we're all kind of swimming in different political identities, and also that we arrive at an understanding of our emotions through our intellect, first of all, that can feel like quite a big ask. And then you add political polarization on top of it. So beyond just mirroring each other's feelings, how is it that empathy allows us to connect in? And I think this is a really important question because then you add on to the more than human world. And like, obviously we're not going to feel the same thing as trees or deer or whatever. So there must be a deeper level here.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to listen to the first few minutes of this podcast. There is much more to this interview. But if you want to hear the full conversation, find the Mongabay newscast wherever you get your podcasts from and click subscribe. You can also get each new episode straight to your inbox by subscribing to Mongabay's weekly newsletter at mongabay.com. And if you really want to support us, you can donate to us at patreon.com/Mongabay. Don't forget to leave a review, and thank you as always for listening.